I died the first time in a debtor's cell, 3 winters after a wedding I had never actually chosen, coughing into hands too swollen with cold to properly cover my own mouth. I was 26. I had spent those 3 years paying debts a man had forged in my name before sailing south with his mistress and a fortune that had once belonged to my family. He had not troubled himself to hide his flight at all, in the end, confident that the guarantees he'd forged against my own signature, witnessed by clerks he'd bribed to look the other way, would hold me to his debts far more effectively than any pursuit ever could. I alone, too late to matter, had learned the whole shape of it, that the man I had married in my sister's place had never once intended to stay long enough for either of us to grow old inside that marriage, and had built his entire courtship around exactly how much of my family's name he could forge before vanishing with the profit. Then I stood in my own bridal dress again, pale gold rather than red, in the same carved hall, watching my sister Boróka tear her wedding veil from her own hair and hurl it at my feet exactly as she had before. "I will not marry him," she said, and did not need to say Victor Ratcha's name for the whole hall to understand precisely whom she meant. I looked at the veil, embroidered thick with gold thread and small red glass beads, and felt the whole flooding weight of a life I'd already lived and died inside of return to me in a single instant: the debts, the forged guarantees, the cell that never warmed, the particular betrayal of learning, 3 months into my own grief, that the man everyone had mourned was very much alive and considerably richer for my suffering. I remembered, too, the particular shape of my own dying, once memory had finished flooding back in full: the damp stone of the cell, the jailer who stopped bothering to bring a second blanket once the physician pronounced my cough unlikely to improve, the last clear thought I had managed being not fear but a kind of exhausted fury at my own younger self, who had believed right up until the very end that enough patience and enough sacrifice would eventually be recognized as love rather than simply expected as habit. I did not step forward, I did not pick up the veil. "No," I said. The hall went silent in the way a room goes silent when it cannot immediately decide whether to be scandalized or simply confused. My mother, Lady Raker, gripped my wrist hard enough to bruise exactly as she had before. "Ilona, please," she whispered. "Do this for your sister. You are stronger than she is." I remembered that whisper. I had obeyed it once, walked into the wrong wedding, married the wrong man, and spent 3 years discovering exactly what my own strength had actually purchased for everyone but myself. "My heart is not involved in this decision, Mother," I said, "and I have found since my last understanding of things that a heart kept carefully out of a decision tends to make rather better ones." My father, Lord Farkas, strode toward me in his deep blue court robe, the one he wore whenever he wished to remind a room that his word carried the weight of law. "Your sister was promised in hate," he said. "Lord Ratch is not a suitable match. Surely you can see that plainly enough to spare her." "He was entirely suitable," I said, "when she begged for him 3 months ago, against both your objections and mine." "I am not spared anything by inheriting a marriage she now regrets, Father. I am only asked again to be the family's convenient answer to a problem she made for herself." Boróka's sobbing paused just long enough for something sharper to flash behind her reddened eyes. "You've changed," she said. "Yes," I agreed. "Death has a way of improving a woman's judgment. My mother's favoritism had never been simple cruelty, whatever bitterness I still carried toward it. Boróka had nearly died of a lung fever at 3 years before I was born myself into a household still half convinced, by the time of my own arrival, that any daughter of theirs might be snatched away by the same illness without warning. My mother had spent Boróka's whole childhood watching her breathe too shallowly on cold nights, and had built, from that old terror, a habit of protecting her elder daughter from every possible disappointment life might otherwise deliver. A habit that had calcified, by the time we were grown, into simply assuming I would always be sturdy enough to absorb whatever Boróka could not. My brother Gaspar, 4 years my junior, had watched this pattern his whole life with a clearer eye than either of our parents ever managed, and had made a quiet, steady practice, since he was old enough to notice it at all, of being the one person in that household who asked after my own health, rather than assuming it automatically sound. "You're allowed to be tired too, Ilona," he told me once. In my first life, the week after I'd first taken Boróka's veil, I had not listened to him then. I intended this time to listen rather more carefully. He found me in the receiving room that same evening, once the scandal of the altar had finally quieted enough for private conversation. "I did not expect you to actually say it aloud," he admitted, sitting across from me with the particular careful relief of a younger brother who had spent years hoping his sister might finally value her own peace as highly as everyone else's. "I have wanted for longer than I can properly say, to hear you refuse this family something plainly, rather than simply absorb it silently the way you always have. I do not intend to make a habit of silent absorption any longer," I told him. "I would value your help, Gaspar, if it comes to that. I think I will need rather more allies than I once assumed I could ask for." "You have always had at least one," he said. "I only wish I had said so rather more loudly, before today." I crossed to the long altar table where 2 marriage contracts lay beneath carved jade weights. One bearing my own name against Lord Tomás Feketes, Warden of Curva, the other bearing Boróka's name against Victor Archer's. I lifted my own contract and slid it into my sleeve, and told the waiting cleric, quite calmly, to read the names precisely as they were written. "You cannot humiliate your sister this way," my mother said. "I am not humiliating her," I said. "I am allowing her to keep the man she chose for herself. I have paid quite enough, in another understanding of things, for choices that were never mine to begin with. I am done paying for her, Mother. I would ask that this family finally notice the difference between love and habit." A new voice entered the hall before my father could answer, calm, unhurried, entirely unbothered by the scandal thickening around us. "Is there a difficulty with the names?" Lord Tomás Feke stood beneath the carved archway, taller than Victor by a full head, dressed in black and silver rather than the wedding red the room had expected, his expression giving away nothing at all. I remembered him only dimly from my first life, a glimpse of straight shoulders and locked iron composure, signing a hastily revised contract without complaint the day my family had rearranged both weddings around my sister's tears. "Lord Feke," my mother began. "Forgive us, Boróka has fallen ill, we thought perhaps no," I said, before she could finish arranging my future around my sister's fear a second time. Tomás's gaze shifted to me, then back to my mother, then settled, with what I can only describe as focused and entirely unhurried interest, on me alone. "My lord," I said, placing my own contract on the table before him, "this bears my name. I intend to honor it. If you are willing, if you are not, I would ask that you refuse me plainly, rather than through my sister's tears and my mother's arranging." Something crossed his face that was not quite a smile, sharper and more interesting than one. He took the contract from my hand and read it in full silence, while my father's composure visibly frayed and Boróka's fear finally outpaced her performance entirely. She had learned, I think, over a lifetime of tears moving rooms exactly the way she wished them to, and had no practiced response ready for a room that had simply stopped moving at all. "I do not trade brides in hallways," Tomás said, and took the brush from the cleric's hand, and signed his own name beneath mine with a stroke so soft it somehow cut through the whole hall's noise more sharply than any shout could have. Victor Ratch arrived at that exact moment, dressed in wedding red of his own, smiling the same careless, triumphant smile I remembered all too well from a marriage that had ended with him 3 provinces distant, and me in a cell he never once looked back toward. He looked between the 2 signed contracts, and for one bare instant before he recovered his charm entirely, I watched something calculating and displeased cross his handsome face. The look I would come to recognize over the following years, of a man discovering that his intended mark had quietly rearranged the whole board before he'd finished admiring his own opening move. "Well," he said smoothly, offering Boróka his arm as though nothing at all had shifted, "it appears I am marrying the sister who actually wanted me after all. I confess I find that considerably less complicated. I did not warn Boróka that morning of everything I remembered. I had decided, walking away from that altar on Tomás Fekete's arm instead, that some warnings a family refuses to hear the first time must simply be allowed to arrive on their own schedule, however much that cost the people too stubborn to listen sooner. Tomas's estate at Kovar was, as his reputation promised, plain, well-ordered, and entirely without the silk and poetry my sister had always found so much more romantic than iron gates and winter ledgers. He did not court me with pretty speeches in our first months of marriage. He asked, instead, precise questions about the estate's accounts, listened carefully to my answers, and treated my opinion on tenant disputes with the same weight he gave his own stewards. "You did not marry me for romance," he observed some months in, watching me correct an error in the household ledger his previous steward had let stand uncorrected for a full year out of simple carelessness. "I did not," I agreed. "I married you because I had already learned rather thoroughly what romance costs a woman who mistakes performance for substance. I find I prefer a husband who signs his own name honestly to one who recites poetry beautifully while emptying my family's coffers behind it." "That is not a very romantic reason to marry a man," he said, though something in his tone suggested he did not mind the reason nearly as much as the words alone implied. "No," I said. "I find I no longer require romantic reasons. I require reliable ones. You have not once, in 5 months, told me anything you did not mean plainly and entirely. I have come to value that rather more than poetry, my lord." He gave me the key to his own study that same week, a plain iron thing, unadorned, cut for a lock that had not been changed in 3 generations. "Iron does not flatter," he said, placing it in my palm, "but it does not lie either. I would rather you have full access to every true account this house keeps, than any performance of trust I could offer instead." I kept that key on the same chain as my own dowry ring from that day onward, and never once, in all the years that followed, found cause to doubt what it had promised me. We learned each other slowly in the unglamorous way 2 careful people build trust when neither has much practice trusting easily. Tomas told me, over that first winter, about his own father's death in a border skirmish when he was barely 15, and the sudden weight of a wardenship he'd had to grow into publicly, under the watching eyes of tenants and rival houses alike, who assumed a boy that young would fail within the year. He had learned, he said, to let his actions answer questions his words might otherwise have answered too slowly to matter. "That is why the whole province believes you cold," I said, understanding for the first time the particular shape of a reputation I had once mistaken, in my first life, for simple bloodlessness. "I am not cold," he said. "I am merely economical with performances I have found rarely survive contact with an actual crisis. I would rather a tenant trust my ledger than my smile, Ilona. A smile costs nothing to fake. An honest account costs a great deal more to maintain consistently, which is precisely why I have always found it the more meaningful gift to offer." I told him, in turn, more of my first life than I told almost anyone else in that second one. Not all of it at once, but in careful pieces, over long winter evenings by his study fire, watching his face for the particular flicker of doubt I half expected and never once actually received. "You believe me," I said once, genuinely surprised, after a fuller telling than I'd risked before. "I have watched you correct my own household's accounts to the last copper coin without once inflating your own effort in the retelling," he said. "A woman that careful with small truths does not strike me as the sort to invent a large one for sympathy. I believe you, Ilona, and I find myself considerably more interested in helping you prevent the danger than in doubting whether it's real. That, more than any single kindness before or after it, was the moment I understood I had married considerably better than either life had once led me to expect." I told him I carried our first child on an ordinary evening some months later, watching his careful, economical composure crack for the first time in our whole marriage into something unguarded and entirely unrehearsed. "I did not expect to want this quite as much as I apparently do," he admitted, holding both my hands with a gentleness that felt, after a lifetime of watching him govern a household through careful reserve, like being handed something rare and deliberately unguarded. "I am told a warden in my position is meant to want an heir, chiefly for the estate's continuity. I confess the estate barely entered my thinking at all just now." "Then we are matched in that, husband," I said, "because I have spent this whole marriage rather more concerned with the family we are actually building than with whatever the province once expected either of us to provide it." He kissed me then, plainly and without performance, exactly the way he did everything else that mattered. And I remember thinking, in that quiet moment before either of us said anything further, that I had spent an entire first life mistaking silence for coldness, when it had only ever been a man saving his rare, unguarded feeling for exactly the moments that deserved it most. Word reached us within the year that Victor Rat's charm had curdled into precisely the pattern I remembered, gambling debts accumulating faster than my sister's dowry could cover them, forged guarantees appearing against accounts she had never actually authorized, the slow, deliberate groundwork of a man preparing to vanish and leave someone else holding the wreckage. I did not act immediately. I want to say that honestly, because some part of me, hardened by 3 years of debt and a cell that never warmed, still carried a private, unlovely satisfaction in watching my sister walk the same road I had once been forced down, this time entirely by her own choosing. It was widow Elizabeth Nagy, a merchant widow who managed a considerable portion of Kovar's grain trade, who first suggested to me that the pattern was larger than my own family's grief. I have seen that signature before, she told me. Over tea I had invited her chiefly to discuss the coming harvest prices, though he wore a different name in the southern provinces 3 years past, and left a different family's fortune considerably poorer for the acquaintance. I did not think much of it at the time. Charming men marry badly connected widows for their money, more often than anyone likes to admit. I think of it rather differently, now that I have heard your own family's history repeated so precisely a second time. She described the southern case in careful detail once I pressed her, a shipping widow named Catalin who had welcomed a charming suitor, calling himself Victor Hallas, into her modest fortune 2 years before Boróka ever met the same man under a different name, and who had lost her entire family's trading fleet to forged guarantees within 18 months of the marriage, before her new husband vanished south with a considerably younger companion and left her to answer for debts she had never once authorized. Did she survive it? I asked, already half certain of the answer and dreading it regardless. Barely, Elizabeth said. She lives now on her sister's charity in a cottage 2 days' ride from here, and has not spoken his name aloud in over a year by anyone's account but her own private grief. I did not connect her misfortune to your sister's marriage until I saw the man himself at your family's own gate 3 months past, delivering some excuse about delayed dowry papers. I recognized the flourish on his signature before I recognized his face. A man can change his name and his charm rather easily. He cannot so easily change the particular way his own hand shapes a letter he's been forming exactly the same way since childhood. I brought Elizabeth's account to Tamas that same evening and watched him go very still in the particular way I had learned, over a year of marriage, meant careful, controlled attention rather than surprise. A man who has done this more than once, he said, will have left more than one province's worth of forged paper behind him. If we can find even 2 more instances of his true hand against a different false name, no court in the realm could call the pattern coincidence. We spent the following 4 months building precisely that case, my brother Gaspar carrying discreet inquiries to 3 provincial magistrates on my behalf, Tamas's own steward Boldizar cross-referencing merchant guild records for any prior appearance of Victor's distinctive, over-flourished signature under whatever alias he had worn before. Elizabeth herself travelled south once, at her own considerable expense, to confirm in person that the Victor Hallas, who had ruined a shipping family in her home province 3 years before, wrote his letter V with the same unmistakable extra flourish as the Victor Rach, currently draining my own sister's household dry. The work was not without its own dangers. Gaspar's inquiries in the second province nearly alerted Victor himself. When a careless magistrate's clerk mentioned the sudden interest in old fraud records to a merchant who, it emerged only later, still did occasional business with Victor's own steward. We spent an anxious fortnight, uncertain whether the whole investigation had been compromised, before Elizabeth's own southern contacts confirmed, with considerable relief, that the clerk's indiscretion had gone no further than idle tavern gossip rather than any direct word reaching Victor's ear. We came closer to losing our advantage than I would like to repeat, Tamas said grim, once the danger had passed. I would ask that future inquiries go through channels rather less prone to idle tavern talk. Agreed, Gaspar said somewhat sheepishly, and conducted the remainder of his own correspondence with considerably more discretion afterward, a lesson he did not need repeating twice. 3 provinces, Gaspar reported, laying in the gathered correspondence across Tamas's own study table the week our case finally came together in full. 3 names, 3 families, each poorer and each considerably more ashamed than the last to admit how thoroughly they'd been charmed into it. Boróka came to me herself at last, in the depth of that same winter, considerably thinner than I remembered her, her composure entirely gone, no performance left in her at all beyond genuine, unguarded terror. "He means to leave," she said, standing in my own receiving room with her hands shaking too badly to properly hold the tea I'd offered her. I found the passage papers myself, hidden in his study. "He has already forged 3 more guarantees against our father's remaining land, Ilona. Once he sails, all of it falls to me to answer for. I do not think I will survive a debtor's cell the way you apparently did, in whatever life you keep referencing that none of us properly understand." I studied my sister for a long moment, weighing the old, unlovely satisfaction against the plainer truth that had grown steadily louder in me over the past 4 months of careful investigation, that stopping Victor now served considerably more people than my sister alone, and that refusing to help her out of old resentment would cost me nothing of his, but would cost 3 provinces worth of future victims everything. "I am not going to marry your debts for you a second time, Boróka," I said. "I want that understood plainly before I tell you what I am going to do instead. I am going to help you stop him, publicly, with evidence rather than tears, because he has done this to 2 other families before ours, and will do it to a 4th, if someone does not finally answer for the pattern rather than merely the personal wound. That is a different thing entirely from absorbing your debt myself. I would ask you to understand the difference this time, rather than simply be grateful for it." She wept, but she nodded, and for the first time in either of my lives, I watched my sister actually listen, rather than simply perform having listened. "What do I do?" she asked, once the weeping quieted enough for practical questions, "if he means to sail within the week? I do not know how to stop a man like that alone." "You do not stop him alone," I said. "You bring me everything you found, the passage papers, the forged guarantees, whatever correspondence he has been careless enough to leave behind. And you let people who have spent 4 months building exactly this case finish the work properly, rather than trying to confront him yourself and risk him simply vanishing a day earlier than planned. I would ask one thing of you in return, Boróka. Whatever comes of this, you do not shield him out of some old habit of believing your own comfort matters more than the truth. I have watched this family do that for you your whole life. I am asking you this once to stop letting it happen on your own behalf." She brought me everything within 2 days, papers hidden in a locked drawer she'd finally thought to search, once her fear outweighed her old loyalty to him, correspondence that confirmed Erzébé's account down to the exact dates of his previous province's ruin, and a passage booking dated a mere 11 days out, timed, I suspected, to coincide with whatever final guarantee he intended to forge before disappearing for good. The week before the Diet convened was its own particular trial, quite apart from the one we were building toward. Boróka moved into a guest wing at Kovar for her own safety, jumping at every unfamiliar footstep, certain until the very morning of the hearing that Victor might somehow slip free of the net we'd spent 4 months weaving and disappear before the Crown could act. "He will not simply vanish this time," Tamas told her with the same plain, steady patience he'd once used to reassure me. "The passage booking you brought us named a specific vessel and a specific date. That vessel has already been quietly detained in harbour these past 3 days, on the Crown's own authority, pending the Diet's judgment. He does not know it yet. He will learn it the moment he tries to board and finds himself arrested instead." "You arranged that without telling me," Boróka said, somewhere between relief and reproach. "I arranged it without telling either of you," Tamas said, "because a plan known to fewer people is a plan less likely to reach the wrong ears before it matters. I hope you'll forgive the caution, given how thoroughly caution has served this particular case so far." She forgave it in the end, though she did not sleep well until the actual morning of the hearing, when word finally came that Victor had indeed been taken at the harbour exactly as planned, protesting his innocence to guards considerably less charmed by his performance than his previous victims had been. The reckoning was called at the Zalan County Diet that spring, the formal assembly at which the province's magistrates and noble houses gathered to settle disputes too large for any single family's private resolution, King Lazar II himself presiding once word reached the capital that a single fortune hunter's fraud had reached across 3 provinces under 3 different names. Erzébet testified first, laying the 3 signatures side by side under the Diet's own lamplight, the identical over-flourished unmistakable across every alias. Gaspar's gathered correspondence followed, 3 separate magistrates confirming 3 separate ruined families, each one believing, until that very hearing, that their own misfortune had been an isolated cruelty rather than one repetition among several. He forged my own father's signature on guarantees against land my father never once agreed to risk, I told the assembled Diet, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. In another understanding of my own life, he did precisely the same to me, forged my own name onto debts I never once authorized, and sailed south the very week the creditors came calling, confident the forged paper would hold me to his crimes, long after he'd made himself impossible to find. It held I died answering for it in a cell that never warmed before winter's end. I did not survive that once to watch him repeat the exact same cruelty against my own sister, and call it simply bad luck a second time. The widow Catalin herself travelled from her sister's cottage to testify, thinner and greyer than her own years should have made her, describing the loss of her family's shipping fleet in a voice that shook only slightly, and steadied considerably by the time she finished naming, plainly, exactly how much of her own ruin had been built on a charm she still could not fully explain having fallen for. I do not tell this story for sympathy, she said to the assembled Diet. I tell it because I believed for 2 years that my own poor judgment alone had cost me everything. I did not know until Lady Alona's own inquiry reached me that I had simply been one repetition among several, and that a pattern noticed early enough might have spared me the whole grief. I would ask this Diet to make certain no 4th woman ever has to learn that same lesson as late as I did. Victor denied everything with a charm that held for exactly as long as it took the Diet's own clerk to lay his true birth records, recovered at last through Erzébet's southern contacts, beside all 3 false identities, proof that the man standing before the king had been born under a 4th name entirely, in a fishing village 2 provinces distant, to a family that had disowned him for an identical fraud committed against his own uncle decades before. King Lazar listened to the whole proceeding with the still careful attention of a monarch who understood that a fraud reaching across 3 provinces under 3 names was not merely a family's private grief, but a wound in the crown's own ability to guarantee honest dealing between its noble houses. He addressed Victor directly before pronouncing judgment, his voice carrying the particular weight of a man who had heard a great many clever denials in his years on the throne, and had grown considerably less patient with them. You have made a career of counting on families too ashamed of their own poor judgment to compare notes with strangers, the king said. I find that considerably more contemptible than simple greed, Master Rutch, or whatever name you were actually born to. Greed is an ordinary human failing. Building an entire livelihood on other people's shame is a rather more deliberate cruelty, and I do not intend to let this Diet's judgment go easy on the distinction. King Lazar's judgment came before the full Diet. Victor Ratch was stripped of every false title he had ever claimed and sentenced to the crown's own labour for the combined value of 3 provinces' worth of forged guarantees, a sentence the king noted would likely occupy the remainder of his natural life. My father's remaining land was restored in full, the forged guarantees against it voided by royal decree the moment the signature forensics were entered into record. Boróka was not charged, since no proof showed she had known her husband's forgeries before the very night she brought them to me herself, though the whole province knew enough of the story by summer that she bore the shame of it regardless, in the particular unglamorous way a woman must live down a mistake. Everyone insists on remembering more vividly than she is allowed to forget it herself. You could have let him simply vanish with what remained, Tomas said that evening, watching the last of the diet's business conclude. It would have cost you nothing further to simply let your sister's fortune go the way it was already going. It would have cost the next family everything, I said, the way it very nearly cost mine everything twice over. I find I did not build this second life simply to protect my own comfort, husband. I built it to make certain the pattern finally had somewhere it could not survive being noticed. I did not fully forgive my mother, in the years that followed, for a lifetime of crying faster for Boróka than she had ever bled for me, though I found slowly that I no longer needed her forgiveness of me either, which loosened something between us that outright reconciliation likely never could have managed as thoroughly. She visited Kuvar twice a year, quieter than she had been, and asked after my own children with a careful humility that never once demanded more warmth than I was willing to offer in return. Boróka rebuilt her own life modestly, in a smaller household on the province edge, and wrote to me perhaps 4 times a year. Honest letters now rather than performances, in which she asked after my family and, increasingly over the years, after my own methods of running a household's accounts honestly, a subject she had never once shown any interest in, before nearly losing everything to a man who counted on her, never learning it. I did not know how to actually manage anything myself, she admitted, on one of her rare visits, watching me review Kuvar's spring accounts with bold desire. I only knew how to be managed, and to cry prettily when the managing went wrong. I find I would like to learn the other way if you are willing to teach me. I taught her, that visit and several after, not out of the old obligation but out of something closer to the plain, unsentimental respect I had once reserved only for Tomas's honest ledgers. It was, I think, the first thing my sister and I ever built together that neither of us later regretted. My father took the king's judgment rather harder than I expected, wounded less by the loss of standing than by the plain evidence, laid before the whole diet that his own long habit of valuing order over honesty had left his family vulnerable to exactly the kind of charming fraud that order was supposed to guard against. I told you Victor was suitable when your sister wanted him, he said to me afterward, older and considerably less certain than the man who had once struck the altar table hard enough to rattle jade weights. I did not ask either time whether suitable meant honest. I find I have spent a great deal of my life confusing the two, Ilona, to considerably more cost than I ever properly reckoned. I would rather you learned it late than never, I said, though I confess I would have preferred you learn it before it cost 2 of your daughters quite so dearly. He visited Kuvar rather more humbly after that, asking after my own household's methods with a curiosity he had never once shown before, and grew slowly into the kind of grandfather who asked a child's opinion before offering his own, a small enough change, in the grand accounting of a life, but one I noticed and valued rather more than I let him know directly. We had 3 children in the years that followed. A son first, steady and watchful in exactly his father's manner, then 2 daughters close enough in age to be raised nearly as twins, both of them fierce in ways that made Steward Boldizar mutter, more than once, that Kovar's iron gates had apparently met their match in the household now living behind them. I gave each of my children their own small key, at the age they were first old enough to be trusted with a locked door of real responsibility, the household stores, the estate's own modest treasury, a study of their own eventual keeping, and told them each, as Tomas had once told me, that iron does not flatter, but it does not lie either. You say that to us the way grandmother says her prayers, my eldest daughter told me once, examining her own small key with the serious attention of a girl who took the ritual rather more seriously than her tone let on. Perhaps it is a kind of prayer, I said. I have found in 2 lives now that plain truth serves a person rather better than pretty performance ever did, however much longer the truth sometimes takes to properly reward you for trusting it. My son, steady from his earliest years in exactly the manner his father had warned me to expect, took to shadowing Boldizar through the estate's own accounts before he was 10, correcting the old steward's minor errors with a bluntness that made Tomas laugh outright more than once at the sheer, unimprovable family resemblance. My daughters, meanwhile, discovered early and enthusiastically that Kovar's iron gates made for excellent climbing practice, a discovery that cost the household considerably more in torn hems than in actual danger, and that Tamas, to my mild exasperation, seemed entirely unable to properly scold them for, given how plainly he admired their nerve. "You are meant to be the stern one in this household," I reminded him, watching him fail utterly to keep a straight face while our younger daughter described, in dramatic and mostly invented detail, her latest conquest of the Eastern Gate's crossbar. "I am economical with performances," he reminded me right back, "not incapable of enjoying one when my own daughter delivers it this convincingly." Boróka visited every summer, without fail, in time bringing her own modest household's accounts for me to review alongside my own, and grew close enough to my children that my eldest daughter began calling her, without any prompting from either of us, simply Aunt Bori in the easy, uncomplicated way children extend family to whoever has actually earned it through patient presence, rather than blood alone. Widow Erzabet Nagy remained a fixture at our own table for every harvest, and made a standing joke, every single year, of reminding my children that their mother's most valuable inheritance had not been any dowry at all, but the particular stubbornness to notice a pattern everyone else had mistaken for simple bad luck. We hosted the whole scattered shape of that found family at Kuvar for my 40th year. Boróka and her own modest household, Gaspar with a wife and children of his own by then, Erzabet holding court over the harvest wine with the same sharp attention she'd once turned on a forged signature, even Catalin, the widow from the southern province, who had accepted my standing invitation at last and arrived, tentative but genuinely pleased, to meet the family whose stubbornness had finally answered the grief she'd carried alone for so many years. "I did not expect," Catalin told me, watching my children argue cheerfully over the last honey cake in a scene that could have been lifted whole from any ordinary, unremarkable family's table, that pursuing justice for my own ruin would eventually deliver me into a dinner this loud and this happy. "I find I do not mind the noise at all after so many quiet years." Steward Boldizar, grown properly old in Kuvar's service by then, still keeps his own set of household keys on an iron ring nearly identical to the one Tamas gave me all those years ago, and has taken, in his later years, to telling any new servant who asks about the household's particular customs, that this family measures a person by whether their word matches their ledger, not by how prettily either one is delivered. A small piece of folklore that has by now outlasted his own memory of exactly where the saying first began. I think some evenings of the woman I was in that cell that never warmed, certain right up until her final winter, that enough patience would eventually be recognized as love. I do not entirely blame her for the mistake. She had been raised, as I once was myself, to believe that a daughter's worth was measured by how much she could absorb without complaint. I am glad, watching my own daughters climb an iron gate their father cannot properly bring himself to scold them for, that neither of them is being raised to make that same mistake in turn. I still carry Tamas's original key on the same chain as my dowry ring, worn smooth now with 20 years of handling, and I have never once in all that time found reason to doubt what it promised me the week he placed it in my palm instead of a poem. Iron does not flatter, but it does not lie either. I built an entire second life on the plain, unglamorous truth of that promise, and I have never once regretted trading the pretty performance my sister once envied me for the honest, steady thing I chose instead.